The Diablo 2 Druid is one of the more eccentric character designs in the game, basically combining 3 distinct playstyles into one character: Elementalist, Shapeshifting Tank, and Summoner. A bit of an odd beast, the Druid is pretty much forced to choose one or two trees and, well, abandon the other one. This is because most of the elemental tree cannot be cast while shapeshifted, so they kind of exclude each other. Of course, Armageddon is an exception to this because it can be cast while shapeshifted, but it is the only one. While I would 100% recommend the Druid, since it is a fun character to play, there are only a few variants of it that are, well, new player friendly, whereas there are some more eccentric variants that are more for seasoned veterans of the game. Stat-wise, the Druid sits a little bit below the Assassin on core stats, with 15 strength, 20 dexterity, 25 vitality, and 20 energy, meaning that he needs to consider a bit of strength early, kind of like a normal caster, to gain enough strength for even basic gear. One unfortunate drawback to the Druid is his growth rates, though, which are very much caster growth rates, only getting 1.5 life per level and 2 life per vitality, and 2 mana per level with 2 mana per energy growth. And of course the standard 1-in-1 stamina growth with levels and vitality. As far as the Druid's breakpoints, those are all fairly slow, but they do change slightly depending on what form he is in. Though in general, he is still on the slower end of things that aren't, well, attack speed. So it takes some consideration as to how you want to build your character, especially if you're going for a melee build, as many times a two-handed weapon can serve you better for this character than sword and board. As far as the skills, the Druid trees are quite different from each other, leading to Druids having 2 drastically different build types and equipment sets. Almost like melee assassins versus trap assassins. That said, in terms of building, most people go for a shapeshift build or an elemental build, and then they choose summon to support it. As with each of the summary guides, we'll focus on the key skills and mostly just give the basics of the less useful or niche skills, saving more nitpicky details for more specific skill guides for specific build types. That said, let's dive into the summon tree. The summon tree is pretty much split into 3 categories: spirits, which grant auras, animals that fight by your side, and vines that sneak around the battlefield providing various effects. An important note, all of these summons, except for the Raven, can be targeted and killed, so especially with the support ones, you'll want them kind of hotkeyed for resummoning in case they get killed, because a lot of them are fairly fragile other than, well, some of the animals. On the spirit side, we have Oak Sage, which provides a percentage boost to life for all allies, Heart of the Wolverine, which boosts attack rating and damage of all allies by 1%, and Spirit of Barbs, which provides a Thorns-like aura that returns melee physical damage at enemies, like thorns. You can only have one spirit up at any given time though, so it's best to choose your favorite and go with it, though be aware that all 3 are relatively fragile, so resummoning may be necessary in the heat of especially tough battles. Next up are the animals. First, the Raven, which summons ravens to deal damage and blind nearby enemies, can be summoned with any combination of other summons. They are, well, their own kind of thing, and they also really don't have much in the way of, interaction with other stuff either, so they're good blind sources. Of course, the ones that do matter, the ones that most people think of whenever they think of Druid summons, are going to be the exclusive animals, where you can have either 5 Spirit Wolves, 3 Dire Wolves, or 1 Grizzly if you have enough points to support that many of that summon. Each of them with their own pros and cons. Like, Spirit Wolves serve as just a basic fast summon, with points boosting defense of your other wolves and bears. Dire Wolves are a bit beefier and consume corpses to get a damage buff, while boosting the life of your other wolves and bears with each point. And Grizzlies are the big beefies of the group and come with a stun attack, which is one of their 2 optional attacks, not to mention boosting the damage of both the types of wolves. Last up, we have the vines. Not that vine, these vines. Poison Creeper, it basically applies poison damage to enemies. It's got an AoE to it, and it uses stationary missiles to do so, if you're wondering the mechanics behind it. Carrion Vine that eats corpses to restore life, and Solar Creeper that eats corpses to restore your mana. Like spirits, you can only have 1 vine active at a time, but at least these can only be hurt whenever they're popping out of the ground. Whenever they're underneath the ground, they're actually immune to damage. Next up, we have the Shapeshifting Tree, which pretty much splits itself between Werewolf on the left and Werebear on the right, with some shared skills in the middle. Werewolf giving increased bonuses to attack rating and speed, and Werebear giving increased bonuses to defense and damage. Both give a boost to base life, making up for the Druid's lower natural life pool to an extent, whereas Werewolf is giving a smaller percent, Werebear gives a larger percent, though most of your maximum life boost is actually going to come from the Lycanthropy skill, which determines the duration of the shape change as well as giving an increasing amount of bonus life when shapeshifted. On the Werewolf side, we're going to start at the bottom up. First off, we have Fury, just sitting down there by itself at level 30. It's basically Fuzzy Zeal. You are a werewolf and you attack very quickly with it. That's essentially what Fury does for you. Going up from that, though, we start getting into slightly more complicated skills. One, we actually have Rabies, which is a contagious poison skill that does poison in a weird way that deserves a whole video of its own. Basically, it transmits the poison that it does do from enemy to enemy, dealing damage, and it can actually get up to a decent amount. It's just a matter of kind of getting the enemies packed together so you actually get a proper amount of transmission with it. Above that, we have Feral Rage, which is the last of the werewolf exclusive skills. It's basically the werewolf charge skill, and yes, the werebear actually has an alternative to this called Maul, but as you attack with it, you gain a growing glowing orb that grants buffs. Basically, the Feral Rage skill gives you an orb that gives you life leech and increases your movement speed, so it's pretty powerful there. On the werebear side, we actually have Shockwave at the bottom. It's an AoE stun that is reminiscent of targeted Warcry, basically. It's pie-shaped Warcry. A good way to lock down groups of enemies to give crowd control, and above that is, well, we mentioned it before, Maul, the werebear's charge skill, which grants a green orb, and it gives the druid stun on attack and additional damage. Finally, in between, we have the skills both forms can use. That is Hunger, which leeches life and mana at high rates, but with a massive damage penalty, and is also kind of neat in that it has a different animation than normal attacks. It really only shares it with one other. And the other one is Fireclaw, the more popular solution for physical immunes for the Shapeshifting Druid. This actually uses the normal attack animation, but it also synergizes with a lot of fire elemental skills from the elemental tree that you can't use while shapeshifted. It doesn't synergize with Armageddon, which has always struck me as weird. Last but not least is a bit more of a straightforward tree, and that is the elemental tree. On the right, you've got wind, on the left, you've got fire. There's probably a methane joke in there somewhere, but all in all, the elemental tree has a lot of fun toys in it. On the fire side, we have Firestorm, which is often an early on choice for speedrunning since it can actually deal a fairly high amount of damage with overlapping trails of fire, and does get buffed from Leaf, so it's really easy to get a +3 skills to it. All of the fire skills are that way in this tree. Anyway, Molten Boulder, which should appeal to anyone looking to get a 7-10 split with a pinch of physical damage with, well, of course, fire, not to mention knockback. It's kind of the go-to second skill that you end up choosing for that. Fissure is the third, and it's a bit less predictable, but it's extremely powerful against large enemies and swarms. Main reason being is there's some RNG involved to the placement of the vents, and there's also a period of time after something gets hit by a vent where it cannot be hit again, but it's excellent for larger monsters like act bosses where you can pretty much consistently be smacking them with a vent, or for swarms like flayers and, well, flayers especially, and also the little maggots. And then there's Volcano, which is exactly what it sounds like, a volcano from the ground that deals damage at its point of origin, as well as randomly around it, of course, because it's a volcano. The one big downside of these initial 4 spells, by the way, is that they all require ground sprites to function. So when enemies like finger mages or ghosts fly off the edge of the map, you have to wait for them to come back to harm them. You can't cast it underneath them because, well, it needs ground to spawn the sprite to deal damage. So that is one important aspect of the fire tree that often makes it not last into Nightmare in Hell difficulty. That and, well, fire resist on enemies kinda hurt it a little bit as well. At the bottom and a bit separate is Armageddon. Yes, it's still a fire skill. In fact, it makes fire rain from the sky for a stretch of time, but it's a bit unique in that it's the only spell you can cast while shapeshifted, which would be awesome, but the spell is heavy RNG. And while it can be manipulated to an extent, it's still super unreliable for the limited damage each meteor drop does. The way you actually end up manipulating it is kind of like how you do Blaze on the Sorceress, is you cast a spell and you run away, or you can sometimes use it by casting it as a werewolf or a werebear and standing in the middle of battle and hoping it hits something, but those are about the only extents that you can actually manipulate that skill. Still an interesting one that you can cast while shifted, though. On the right-hand side, we've got Wind, which is your source of physical and cold damage for the Elementalist. Far right is Arctic Blast, which suffers the same problems as Inferno, inconsistent and low damage, so recommend avoiding it. It's not going to win any awards. It looks a lot more impressive than it actually is. Cyclone Armor, on the other hand, is actually pretty handy since it works for lightning, fire, and cold damage, kind of like how Bone Armor on a Necromancer works for physical. It's an extra layer of life against these sources of damage and pain and suffering, and also it's a synergy that's actually worth investing in for Tornado and Hurricane. Speaking of tornadoes, and, well, the other spinning wind, Twister, Tornado, which are the next two on the list, are two very powerful skills. Twister for a small AoE that causes stun and physical damage, and Tornado for a larger but harder to hit bit of physical damage that can actually wipe things out fairly quickly because it's several thousand bits of damage whenever it's fully leveled. These skills are often paired with the last spell, which is the other spinning wind, Hurricane, for what is essentially going to be called a wind druid by most people. Basically, you cast Hurricane to deal reliable AoE damage around you for a duration. It's cold damage for however many seconds, and since it's spinning around you, it's gonna hit pretty much anything near you, and charge up to enemies while casting Tornado and or Twister to finish off tougher monsters and to crowd control them. It's kind of a very simple trick, but it works exceptionally well. It's also worth noting that if you cast Hurricane and then Shapeshift, the Hurricane will continue for its full duration. You cannot recast it unless you shapeshift out. There are some casting delays as well in there that can cause it to be a little bit tricky to do consistently in the heat of battle. The Druid definitely leaves a lot of options open, and while there may be classes that can beat it out in a specific given specialty, the amount of flexibility and choice with the Druid makes it one of the more interesting classes in the game, and neither Shapeshifters or Elementalists end up underpowered by any stretch of the imagination. It's just that, well, Zealots and Sorceresses generally will do a little bit better on that, but they don't have the diversity, and they also don't have the summons that the Druid has to support them, so it kind of balances itself out by allowing the Druid to be a little bit more flexible at the cost of speed.